Well, comrades, it is 12 noon here in Sewanee and lunchtime wherever you are as well. It's great to be able to welcome you to the first of this year's Lunch and Learns from the School of Theology. My name is Justin Anthony. I'm the newly appointed coordinator for alternative and continuing education programs here at the School of Theology, which means you should realize that this is part of continuing education. So for those of you who need to have continuing education hours from your diocese, please make a note of the fact that you have attended a continuing education discussion with Mother Julia Gatta. She is I should have checked this beforehand, Julia. The Bishop Frank A. Juhan or Yuhan?
Juhan.
Juhan Professor of Pastoral Theology in the School of Theology, the University of the South in Sewanee. She's an Episcopal priest. She's served parishes in Connecticut for 25 years before coming to Sewanee in 2004 and has had no time off for good behavior since. She's got a PhD in medieval studies from Cornell University and is the author of The Pastoral Art of the English Mystics, The Nearness of God, Parish Ministry as Spiritual Practice with Martin Smith, Go in Peace, The Art of Hearing Confessions, and Life in Christ, Practicing Christian Spirituality. And she's worked as a spiritual director, retreat leader for many years. And her talk today is going to be Jesus, the Use of Wealth, Teaching Stewardship at the End of Year C. We shall have an opportunity for questions and answers towards the end of the session. Please think of really good questions because I'm only going to pick the good ones to be asked to Mother Julia. Mother Julia, over to you.
Thank you so much, Justin. I chose today's topic for the start of our academic year because the autumn Gospels in Year C present opportunities to ponder Jesus's teachings and parables that deal in various ways with wealth. And in the fall, as I remember well from my days as a parish priest, many parishes are already planning their stewardship drives. This year, we can do that under the tutelage of St. Luke, who, as we know, particularly underscores economic justice in his gospel, a theme he carries forward in the Acts of the Apostles. Stewardship, of course, encompasses more than finances, whether we're thinking of church finances or those of individual church members. It's a broad topic touching upon our care for all aspects of our lives, relationships, communities, and this planet. Even when churches and individuals grapple with the hard question, how much should we give away to churches or other worthy causes? This single aspect of stewardship should not be construed, as it sometimes is, as giving something back to God, a portion or a percentage, as if the rest was for ourselves to do with as we please. No, if nothing else, the sacrificial dynamic of the Eucharist should make clear that in union with Christ, we offer the entirety of ourselves. Every aspect of our lives is part of that oblation. What we give away is but one dimension of that searching discernment of how we are spending. And here I use the financial metaphor deliberately, how we are spending all of our lives, all of our choices, and all of our gifts. That's what makes it so hard. In this hour, I won't be seeking to be prescriptive about what precise shape your stewardship teaching might take. I couldn't do that anyway, since your teaching depends upon your context to a certain extent. Nor am I going to suggest how to preach these Gospels, although I hope our work this afternoon will assist your preparation for that ministry. Our task today is more modest. Simply to take a brief look at two Gospels we've already heard this summer, and then take a closer look at three Gospels that are coming up in the next couple of months that deal with attitudes towards wealth and the use of it. Well, it's clear from the Bible as a whole that our use of the financial resources at our disposal is a matter of grave moral and religious import. These particular Gospels show a certain breadth of perspective, especially once we get to the story of Zacchaeus. As we begin, I think we ought to admit that the whole question of the right use of wealth is a matter of discernment that most of us struggle with. There are no easy answers, and even across the New Testament, there are a variety of responses and solutions. Yet at the same time, even in the small set of texts we'll be considering today, there are also some persistent themes and principles that unite them. Considering this sampling of Lucan Gospels can perhaps fill out at least part of that larger picture, some consistent principles or attitudes, and some diversity of application. These Gospels then can serve not just as remote preparation for financial stewardship drives in a parish, important as these are, but also for whatever light they might shed on the sacred task of personal money management. For the Church needs to offer some guidance in this difficult area of responsibility and have something to say about money beyond "give us some of it," as Dan Hotchkiss once quipped. At this point, I'd ask that you have ready to hand either a New Testament or a lectionary book. Now, St. Luke has already been presenting us with stories and parables about money, its uses, and its dangers. At the beginning of August, our gospel began at Luke 12, verse 13, with an inheritance quarrel between two brothers. And what family doesn't have an inheritance squabble somewhere in its history? Understandably enough, one of the men comes to Jesus to settle the dispute. Who better? But Jesus doesn't see himself as an arbitrator, but as a teacher. He minces no words. Be on your guard against all kinds of greed, for one's life does not consist in the abundance of possessions. Jesus starts off with a warning. Wealth is alluring, and it's easy to fall into the trap of wanting more and more. The vice of avarice is, as St. Thomas Aquinas observed, bottomless. As members of an American culture that has been characterized by greed from at least the time of Alexis de Tocqueville, who took a look at our habits in the 19th century, this brief gospel word is one for us to take to heart. Then Jesus launches into the parable of the rich fool, the man who was blessed with a banner crop, but whose response to such good fortune is entirely self-referential, as not only his actions, but also his thoughts, which are rather humorously and mockingly portrayed, abundantly display. It seems that the constant concern reiterated in the Hebrew scriptures for the vulnerable members of his community never so much as crossed his mind. In the end, he couldn't take it with him. His flush of good fortune did neither him nor anyone else any good. Then in mid-August, with Proper 15, we heard still more teaching about wealth. Continuing in chapter 12, Jesus presents the kingdom as sheer gift. Do not be afraid, little flock, for it is your Father's pleasure to give you the kingdom. And what is the proper response to this divine generosity? Human generosity, of course. Position yourself, says Jesus, so you can give to others. Sell your possessions and give alms, he counsels. And as in the parable of the rich fool, Jesus connects this move to our mortality. He goes on to say, make purses for yourselves that do not wear out, an unfailing treasure in heaven, where no thief comes near and no moth destroys. As we'll see, the link between mortality and money is a motif that carries forward in the next two parables coming up. These earlier teachings and parables in Luke are vitally connected to the parables of Lazarus and the rich man, the unjust manager, and the story of Jesus and Zacchaeus, which are the particular focus of this Lunch and Learn. Even though the parable of the unjust manager comes just before that of Lazarus and the rich man in St. Luke's Gospel, propers 20 and 21 respectively, falling on September 21st and 28th this year, I'd like to discuss the more familiar and straightforward parable of Lazarus and the rich man first, because it throws some light backwards, as it were, on the other parable. You all know this one, which is found in Luke 16, beginning at verse 19. Jesus is drawing on the classic literary trope of role switching. Think of The Prince and the Pauper, or Shakespeare's Henry IV, or the film Trading Places with Eddie Murphy, one of the funniest movies I've ever seen. There's humor at work in this parable, and the next one we'll consider too, just as there was satire at play in the parable of the rich fool. Lazarus and the rich man end up trading places when, after death, note the mortality motif, Lazarus goes to Abraham's bosom and the rich man to you know where. It is, of course, significant that from the get-go, Lazarus is identified by a proper name, while the rich man is rendered completely nameless. In a parable all about reversals, Jesus here flips the expected social convention by which the rich not only have a name, but make a name for themselves by the power their wealth wields, and the poor do not. The two men are portrayed, perhaps even caricatured, as polar opposites. The rich man with his costly purple linen and daily feasting, Lazarus so pathetic that even dogs have pity on him. But God's justice finally prevails, and their fates are inverted. You would have thought that the rich man, finding himself in hell after death, might have learned his lesson. But his post-mortem character remains unchanged. Even though he's roasting in hell, he continues to look upon Lazarus as his social inferior and treats him as his personal lackey. Father Abraham, send Lazarus to dip his finger in water and cool my tongue. Jesus is having a bit of fun here as he employs considerable literary art to paint this scene. The story continues with Abraham patiently explaining, "No can do." I might add here that in some congregations, it might be pastorally wise to remind people that parables are stories invented to make a point. And this one is not a tour guide to the geography of the afterlife. The rich man's next errand for Lazarus, that he visit his 5 brothers back home to warn them, cannot be taken as an act of charity, but as an example of the way rich people typically care only for their own. Turned down once, the rich man still presses the point. If someone goes to them from the dead, they will repent. Abraham counters by insisting that the scriptures say it all. Since they have Moses and the prophets, they won't be convinced, even if someone rises from the dead. This is the parabolic punchline, because Luke, of course, is writing for an audience which knows that someone has indeed risen from the dead. So the parable serves as a warning as much for us, post-resurrection people that we are, as for the first hearers of it. The rich man had created the chasm between himself and Lazarus when he distanced himself from his plight, ignoring a man at his very doorstep. Now let's turn to the parable of the unjust manager, which comes at the beginning of chapter 16. It illustrates, among other things, what a shrewd observer Jesus was of everyday happenings and of all sorts of people, including types like this sleazy character. The story starts off with a reckoning. A wealthy landowner has discovered leakage in his assets, and he traces the loss back to his estate manager, who has no doubt been pocketing the difference. Then, as now, rich people relied on smart people to manage their sizable assets for them. Managers, or stewards to use the older term, exercised considerable power over the property and persons under their authority. This particular manager now experiences the shock of finding that he will soon be out of a job once he gets the books back in order. But he doesn't put them back in order. He continues to exploit his position and influence to ensure a cushy landing for himself once he is really out on the street. What's crucial to recognize in this parable is the larger social and economic context in which the story is told, and that Jesus would have assumed was common knowledge among his listeners. Namely, that this is a system heavily dependent on patronage, on wealthy benefactors who could protect you or advance you up the career ladder in a largely static and stratified society. Vestiges of this still exist today in our own country, only we call it networking. The disgraced manager calls in his boss's debtors and gives them an exorbitant and unauthorized discount, in one case by 50% and in another by 20%. In other words, he's doing what he's best at, taking advantage of what remains of his position to bilk his employer to his own gain. Jesus supplies a telling detail in the story to signal, just in case we missed it, that the soon-to-be ex-manager is doing all this in bad faith and on the QT when he says to the first creditor, "Sit down quickly and make it 50." We might expect that the rich landowner would be outraged at finding himself cheated once again. But no, he is instead impressed, maybe even amused, by his former manager's street smarts. He's managed to cultivate other wealthy patrons who will no doubt be indebted to him for his dishonesty on their behalf. He'll be welcomed by them, maybe given a new position. So his former employer commends him for this latest bit of monetary sleight of hand. Maybe the landowner is none too honest himself in his business dealings. But in any case, he admires the manager's cleverness, his financial savvy, his strategies of self-protection, even though they come at the landowner's expense. Where does Jesus go with all of this? Rather atypically, Jesus pivots at this point and starts to suggest where the moral of this unsavory story is going. He starts by wryly observing the children of this age are more shrewd in dealing with their own generation than are the children of light. Not for the first time does Jesus censure the mental dullness of disciples or people of faith. The movers and shakers of this age are just plain smarter in dealing with money, in knowing how to invest it, than are the disciples, the children of light. So, what are we supposed to do with our own financial and other assets? Jesus returns to the patronage system and recommends using it to our advantage, just as the dishonest manager did. Make friends for yourself, he says. Make friends for yourself by means of dishonest wealth, so that when it is gone, they may welcome you into the eternal homes. But who are the they to whom Jesus refers? Just who might welcome us into the eternal homes, the way the manager expected to be welcomed into the earthly homes of those for whom he used money dishonestly to their and his advantage. There is no noun antecedent to tell us who the they are. In fact, even the pronoun doesn't stand alone, but is embedded in the verb, as is the case with inflected languages such as Greek. We should be shrewd enough to figure out that the ones in a position to welcome us into the eternal homes are the poor, the Lazaruses of this world, now resting in the bosom of Abraham. Jesus seems to be saying, use your wealth, whatever it may be, to help the poor. And they'll be on your side when you need it, at that final reckoning, at which we will all fall short. I think it is unfortunate that the word rendered by the NRSV as wealth was translated at all. Other, usually older versions of the Bible just leave the Semitic word there as is. It's mammon, and usually rendered the adjective attached to it as unrighteous, meaning that mammon is inherently unrighteous. True, mammon became a synonym for riches or wealth, but mammon was first the Near Eastern god of wealth. Like all gods, mammon requires sacrifices from its devotees, and people will indeed give up their lives, sacrifice their marriages and families, their health, and their very souls in devotion to the never-ending demands of this God. By using this word, Jesus is once again signaling the idolatrous magnetism of wealth. You cannot serve God and mammon, he concludes. But Jesus also alerts us to the good we can perform if we use this dangerous stuff carefully, shrewdly, by cultivating the right kind of patrons, the poor. As Mary proclaims at the beginning of St. Luke's Gospel, he has put down the mighty from their seats and lifted up the lowly. You want to have friends in high places, the high places of heaven. Finally, I want to jump ahead to Luke 19, proper 26, which won't show up until November 2nd, when it will probably get bumped in many places by an All Saints Sunday observance. But the story of Zacchaeus is an episode that is remarkable on several levels. For starters, it shows Jesus at his pastoral best. He says at the end of the story, the Son of Man came out to seek and save the lost. Came out from where? From Galilee, to be sure, but ultimately from the heart of the Divine Father. But to get back to the beginning of this story, it occurs as Jesus enters the city of Jericho, an important city en route to Jerusalem. So a lot of people had to come through the city gates, and that gave tax collectors like Zacchaeus an extensive clientele. And Zacchaeus, we're told, was the chief tax collector to boot. His fellow citizens would have loathed him for good reason, since he had gotten rich off their backs, largely through extortion, as was the common practice. But Jesus sees more than a financial opportunist and Roman collaborator here, and to everyone's amazement, invites himself to dinner at Zacchaeus' home, singling him out for this distinctive honor. Not surprisingly, this move doesn't sit at all well with the locals. Zacchaeus, by contrast, is overwhelmed with joy. To Jesus, he's something other than a pariah. Now, the story, as we have it, is quite compressed. But the upshot is that Zacchaeus undergoes a conversion of heart. He pledges half his possessions to the poor, and he'll return all ill-gotten gain fourfold, more than twice what Torah required. To Zacchaeus's grumbling neighbors and to Zacchaeus himself, Jesus declares, "Today salvation has come to this house, because he too is a son of Abraham." If Zacchaeus had for a while forgotten his true identity, it is now restored to him. He is a son of Abraham. If his neighbors had forgotten this too, they are in effect urged to take back their kinsman, as much a child of Abraham as they are themselves. The story underscores the communal fallout of good and bad money decisions. Zacchaeus had hurt his fellow townspeople and had undermined the communal harmony he should have shared with them. Everybody was a loser in this situation. But when grace shows up, manifested first in Jesus, and then taking hold of Zacchaeus, salvation comes not only to the house of Zacchaeus, but also to the people of Jericho when authentic community is restored. With respect to wealth and our relation to our possessions, the story of Zacchaeus stands in contrast to that of the rich ruler, whom Jesus had invited to sell everything, giving the proceeds to the poor, in order for that man to become sufficiently unencumbered to follow Jesus all the way to Jerusalem. When the grace of salvation comes upon Zacchaeus, however, there is a different outcome. While Zacchaeus is extraordinarily generous in the end, he is not asked for this totalizing gesture of complete dispossession. Presumably, he remains a rather rich man. We can see from this episode, then, as well as from other parts of the New Testament, a diversity of generous responses, all of which depend upon particular circumstances. St. Paul is distinctly aware of this, and in 2 Corinthians 8 shows a remarkable sensitivity in this regard when discussing the matter of financial generosity among Christians. What might be some of our takeaways as we listen to these Gospels and ponder them in our hearts? Jesus offers some very explicit ascetical teaching. Take care. Be on your guard against all kinds of greed, is his initial response to the inheritance dispute. It's easy to want more for ourselves, whether we need it or not, and whether or not our neighbor has the bare necessities. In a consumerist economy that thrives on fostering artificial needs, and where pampering ourselves can be billed as self-care, it is a warning to take seriously. Jesus also, in these stories and by these parables, reminds us of the inevitability of death. The rich fool dies and his grandiose schemes come to naught. Lazarus and the rich man reverse their positions after their deaths. We're advised to invest in the poor so they will welcome us into the eternal homes after we die. We're to make purses for ourselves constructed from generous deeds that will survive the ravages of time and, unlike our bodies, are incorruptible. Death, in other words, offers a perspective, a big horizon, against which we make financial decisions now that have eternal significance. The point isn't for preachers to use the fact of death to scare people with the threat of hellfire, to bully them into giving up their cash. That isn't our way, thank goodness. But in the Episcopal Church, we do tend to shy away from speaking of sin, like greed, or death. Yet awareness of our mortality can help us appreciate the marvelous gift of life and fill us with a sense of thanksgiving, which in turn often prompts generosity. Since we only have one life, why not do all the good we can? Share our benefits, both spiritual and material, with others while we have the chance. And for that matter, we can also continue service to others after death through organ donation and by religious and charitable bequests in our wills, as the Book of Common Prayer teaches. Finally, Jesus shows us where to locate our values. One's life does not consist in the abundance of possessions. Not much in our larger culture supports this view. Indeed, much of our culture and advertising and sensationalist news works vigorously against it. And so many people are, as a result, deeply unsettled and unhappy. There is another way of framing the meaning of life, of discovering the holy path of sacrificial discipleship. And the church is blessed with proclaiming this gospel. Thank you.
Mother Julia, thank you so much for what was inevitably a tour de force. As our comrades are reconsidering their lives, their decisions, and their pocketbooks, I want to give them a few minutes to think about any questions that they might have for you. Friends, you'll see on the bottom of your screens, on the bottom of the Zoom screen, a Q&A button for you to type in any questions that you might have. Whilst you're considering those things, let me just do the little bit of housekeeping so that you can put into your calendars the remaining faculty lunch and learns for the rest of the year. There is a QR code in the bottom right-hand corner of the screen, which you shouldn't need because you managed to find a way to register for this lunch and learn, so you should already know where to go. But that QR code will take you to the engagement page on the School of Theology's website. And our next lunch and learn is just over a month's time, when Dr. Hilary Dow Ward will be talking to us about parish pedagogy, which is a word I can never say. If you build it, they will come. marks to those of you who recognize the quotation from Field of Dreams. Andrew Thompson on Ethics for Christians and Other Aliens, Reed Carlson on Encountering Spirits in the Bible, for all fans of Scottish whiskey. And then next year, further on next year, Christian Identity After Nicaea and A Love Supreme, 3 American Psalms from Britta Carlson and Mark Ardrey Graves. The details are on the parish website. And taking from Mother Julia the lesson that we should learn, which is what I've taken, is that you have money, please give it to us. Support Sewanee today. If you like the Lunch and Learn and you'd like these things to continue at the moment, they are free and open to all. And there is a really psychedelic QR code there for you to be able to support Sewanee for its ministry in preparing devout, learned, and useful clergy and laity for the service of God and his church. So, having said all that, and looking at the Q&A box, we have at the moment no questions, which is great because that means it gives me the opportunity to ask my question whilst people are still considering. Mother Julia, in the American context, is it easier or to preach on sexual morality than it is to preach on financial morality? And if so, why is that?
I think they're both really hot topics that we do everything we can to avoid, at least in the Episcopal Church, I would say. Oh my, I would be hard pressed, Justin, to say which was harder. I think, again, it depends so much on context, right?
Right.
There are places where it's going to be very difficult to preach on sexual morality. I think almost most places, unless I would say probably fairly conservative congregations, which tend to emphasize personal morality, and liberal congregations tend to are really comfortable in talking about and preaching about social justice. And of course, the prophets talk about both. It's not an either or for them, and they actually go hand in hand because they're both concerned with integrity and community in different ways. But money also, right, is also concerned with integrity and with community. And certainly with a recognition that we all belong to one another in Christ. And therefore, to follow, Luke's kind of idealized picture of the Jerusalem community, there needs to be some sharing. I referenced, 2 Corinthians there, chapter 8, 2 Corinthians chapter 8, where Paul, I think, very pastoral, he's taking up the collection, he's talking to the Corinthians about the collection for the saints in Jerusalem who are having a hard time of it. And he says, not that you should give so much that you yourselves are disadvantaged, but so that there might be an equality. I mean, I find that so extraordinarily practical and contemporary. Of course, equality is always a receding horizon. I mean, we'll never reach there, but that there should be at least an attempt, a straining forward towards sharing, which takes one's neighbor's need to heart as much as one's own. Right. Surely that's what it means to love one's neighbor as oneself.
Yes. We've got lots of questions coming in, and on an anti-gospel principle, I'm going to go the first shall be first. So Cameron has asked, the parable of the dishonest manager makes it clear that Jesus is telling the parable immediately after the parables beforehand, the lost sheep, the lost coin, and the prodigal son. And Cameron's wondering whether this ties to wealth. And do you find any value in thinking about it that way? In what, I suppose, in short, in what ways are the parables part of a systematic teaching?
Well, I think it's maybe the sense of lost is more with Zacchaeus. The Son of Man has come out to seek and save the lost. I mean, I think that's where the lost sheep, the lost coin, the lost son really tie in more with Zacchaeus. in the other two, the two middle ones, the Lazarus and the rich man, and the parable of the unjust steward, I would say that isn't the primary theme. I think Jesus is just talking about another, as I read it, there's another topic here on the table for him that he wants us to pay attention to.
Right. I'm anonymizing some of these people because they're asking questions which give an indication of where their context they're coming from. William serves in a parish where there's a history of mistrust about money, how the parish and past rectors have used it and how the diocese has used it. How do you inspire confidence in parishioners in about how the parish uses its financial resources? Whoa, I'd like to know that answer.
Well, I think transparency is the answer. Um, a trust is something that doesn't come instantly. Trust is something earned, whether it's about money or anything else. Um, Trust is cultivated by a series of experiences that render the person trustworthy or the situation trustworthy. And so it will be, I think, necessary in such a context for the rector, for the finance committee, for the treasurer to be uh, as trustworthy, as transparent as possible, posting every month online or in the parish hall reports about where the parish stands financially. Sometimes this this trust is created, in a sense, enhanced by distrust, is enhanced by poor money management, where you have a zillion different little pockets
Mm.
where money can be stuffed. And cleaning that up so that it is easier to follow the money, you might say, I think will also enhance your transparency and the readability of spreadsheets and other financial tools that should be regularly presented to the parish. Of course, at an annual meeting, there should be a review of the entire fiscal situation um, of the parish in a spreadsheet and a proposed budget, and the budget has which the vestry adopts presented to the parish. So just information and showing what happens to the money will, I think, begin to cultivate this, but it won't happen overnight.
So the next question is entirely contradictory to that because it's about the dishonest manager and the absolute lack of transparency in his behavior. But Lisa's wondering whether Jesus is hearkening back to the trickster characters that you find in particular the Hebrew scriptures in Jacob and Tamar and other people like that. And do you think he's expecting people to have an idea that the dishonest manager is a trickster?
Well, he certainly seems to be one in part, right? I mean, he's a uh, he is an Israelite full of guile, like Jacob is, constantly trying to pull the wool. A metaphor that probably occurs to me because it's so about sheep, right? Stealing Laban's sheep and all of that. I mean, there's lots of tricksters. And it's so remarkable that the Hebrew scriptures present the great heroes of their past, their ancestors, as something other than spotless personalities. So yeah, he is a sly guy. Sit down quickly and make it 50.
Cool. Lisa, being cheap, is also using her question to say Jordan says hello, Mother Julia. So
Oh, hi,
Jordan
Jordan.
says hello. To go back to transparency, Josh is asking, as a priest, how does one be transparent about the support that one gives oneself to a particular cause or to a particular charity? Trying to balance the idea between not letting your left hand and your right hand know what you're doing, but on the other hand, witnessing to something that is good. How do you balance between parish giving publicly or privately as a minister?
Well, I think that you indicate that that you give a gift without
Mhm.
necessarily attaching a dollar sign to that. Um, because, and the problem with attaching a dollar sign, I think, is that it can very easily slip into shaming the poor who will
Mhm.
not have a big dollar sign next to their gift, but which may be very sacrificial nonetheless. So I would simply say to indicate that one gives to the church. I used to sometimes make a point of saying that I try to give to some causes that are not well funded, such as environmental ones, which are nonetheless absolutely um, needful today, and which help the poor in a rather indirect way, but are are very, very important for our common life.
Um, Jocelyn asks something which goes back to, I think, my first question about the emotional difficulty of engaging with the questions of money, and wondering if there was what you think might be the underlying, perhaps psychological drives that influence how difficult it is for us to address questions of financial responsibility openly. Saying, is there something that seems to drive the greed that's so pervasive today? Fear and maybe a kind of interpersonal social poverty or loneliness. How do I fund my long-term care? Who will? Do we have to address a psychological reluctance before we can actually talk about the practical things that we do with our money?
Well, let me say that I don't think that generosity overturns the need for prudent savings. Uh, Jesus, part of shrewdness is also prudence. And Jesus warns against being imprudent at various points in the gospel. You don't build a tower and then discover halfway through you don't have enough materials. Uh, so I don't think that, say, funding your, I just sent in a very hefty check for my own long-term care insurance. Which I intend as a prudential measure to protect my assets. So, for one thing, so the bequests that are in my will can actually reach the charities that I want them to reach, as well as to my heirs, immediate heirs, my family. So, um, that kind of financial prudence, I think, is actually part of what's kind of behind the parable of the unjust steward. Don't be stupid about money, and put your money where it counts. A lot of people think that of money as so much as a of their giving away as a spiritual exercise, which it certainly is. But that doesn't rule out you don't pay attention to where it's going
Yeah.
and how much good it's doing, and whether the charities you are giving to, in fact, use your money well. All those things I think are incumbent upon us to be financially responsible stewards of the gifts which have been entrusted to our use.
It's a real challenge, isn't it? Is constantly interrogating, am I being prudent or am I being greedy? Am I
That's
and am I rationalizing my greediness by camouflaging it as prudence?
uh, I think we are always subject to self-deception, which which is why it's helpful again maybe to talk about these things with trusted um, uh, fellow Christians who can who can help us interpret our situation. The other thing I would say there is that I think it's best not to address these issues from some sort of a standpoint of certainty or an Olympian height. To acknowledge that this is an area of real struggle for all of us. It's really hard. Um, but one of the things, as those of you who have been through parish administration with me know that, in part of, I think, again, I referenced at the very beginning, the offering of our total selves uh, to God in union with Christ, which is expressed in the Eucharistic prayers, means that the money that we spend on ourselves or on our children or saving is just as sacred as money that we give away. And therefore, we shouldn't make a kind of false dichotomy here. But it also means that our consumer choices It's not like we can just keep, give so much to the church and then we can just spend anywhere. Our consumer choices have a huge impact on others and on this planet. And therefore, they too are a matter of grave moral import.
We've got very little time left, so I'm going to combine two questions into one final one. And apologies to those of you who didn't get your questions addressed. But one person who's already anonymized themselves, I love the lack of trust in me, but wanting to know the connection between Jesus's teaching on wealth and annual stewardship campaigns. And a question which goes with that from Tom is it possible to put a figure on how much people should give when a parishioner asks, how much shall I give? Do you say all or 50% or 10% or no number at all? Which is a cop out, and how do we actually address these things practically in a parish stewardship campaign?
I don't think you can be prescriptive about a percentage or an amount to anybody. It depends very much on their particular circumstances. I mean, some people may have quite a lot of money and not a whole lot of responsibilities. They may not be supporting aging relatives or trying to put children through school, and they may be able to give quite a lot of money to the church. And other people may be barely able to pay the rent and pay the gas to get to work so they can even make the money to pay the rent. It is so different in different contexts and congregations. And that's why I say there's not an easy answer, but people need to ask themselves, what are my real needs? What are the real needs of those who have a rightful claim on my financial resources? And what are the needs of this parish that have a claim on me too?
Um, I think, comrades, it's a couple of minutes to the end of the hour. I think we are all incredibly annoyed at Mother Julia for setting the challenge so clearly to us. I'm going to go away and brood about exactly how lacking in prudence and wisdom I have been in my stewardship of resources. The one thing I will take away, Julia, is the way that you beautifully describe the inversion of the patronage
Mm,
relationship in Jesus. Be nice to the poor because they're the ones who are going to be easing your way into the kingdom. And I'd never thought of it that way before.
mm.
So, all of you who have joined us, I'm sure that you will wish Mother Julia every good wish for her challenging teaching, and I hope that it will help you in parish stewardship campaigns or in your own pilgrimage in this world. Thank you to all who participated and to those of you who asked questions, and my apologies to those of you who didn't get your questions answered. See you all next month on October the 14th when Hilary Dowd will be talking to us about parish pedagogy. In the meantime, have a wonderful rest of the day, all of you. Thank you.
Thank you. Blessings to all of you.